The College Football Playoff Committee has spoken, and they have spoken in a very big way. So, going into the rankings this afternoon or this morning, wherever you're at in the country, the big question mark was who was going to be number 4, as we had Alabama as a lock, Clemson as a lock, and Notre Dame as a lock. Although some could argue that Notre Dame shouldn't necessarily deserve to be in there, but we're going to get into that towards the end, back when the whole analysis comes into play. So I'm just going to set the tone really quickly. So the big question mark was who was number 4? Was it going to be Oklahoma? Was it going to be Ohio State? Does Georgia have any say in this? Do they have an argument? As some people last night, kind of throughout these last 12 hours before the rankings were revealed, some had an argument saying that Georgia could have a case to be in the top 4. And some say it's just the pro SEC. The SEC is just the media's pro SEC, or the anti SEC has you can't lose 2 games, a 2-loss non-conference champion shouldn't be in the playoff discussion. They say the pro SEC just wants to see 2 teams in the playoff again. Some say they just want to see Alabama and a Georgia rematch. But ultimately, what was the final decision is we know that Alabama, Clemson, Notre Dame, they're going to be the top 3. And the question was who was going to be that 4th team. And the committee decided to put in the Oklahoma Sooners over Ohio State and Georgia. But what really stuck out to me in these rankings is it's a big telling of the difference between what Oklahoma and Ohio State, what their difference was. It looked to have been a lot bigger than what I thought last night and what a lot of people thought last night and what a lot of people thought throughout the week. So I think it's evident that the difference between Oklahoma and Ohio State was huge because they put in Georgia at 5 behind Oklahoma and ahead of Ohio State, despite Georgia not winning their conference championship. So I think that's a huge factor of why Oklahoma was that team, and it should have been a no-brainer. But you could also make arguments and say that maybe there should have been some debate. But let me just picture this for you. We've had the current college football playoff format. This is the 5th year of the format. And the first year that we had it, back in 2014, TCU was 3 on the final week. Ohio State was number 6. And Ohio State, they ended up leapfrogging the Big 12 into that Final 4 back in the first year in 2014. That's where Ohio State pulled off the upset against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl. And then they pulled off the upset against Oregon in the national championship game. And that's kind of where Ezekiel Elliott got a household name. So some would say that maybe that was the right decision that year. Others still say that maybe it wasn't. But that made the decision look good on the committee because Ohio State eventually beat Alabama and Oregon for the national championship. And this year's Ohio State team, it kind of looks similar to the Ohio State team from that year, where they've picked up their 2 of their biggest wins of the season back-to-back against Michigan and in the Big Ten championship game. This Ohio State team has done the exact same thing that the Ohio State team back in 2014 did to sneak into the college football playoff. And maybe some people speculated, could Ohio State jump the Big 12 again as they did before? However, here's what you want to look at. You could say that Oklahoma, Ohio State, and Georgia, you could make arguments that all 3 of those teams were deserving of that 4th spot. But here's the one flaw in that. Let's look at Georgia first. You could say that Georgia has played competitive football. You can say Georgia's beaten some very good teams this season. You can say Ohio State's beaten some very good teams this season. However, Georgia and Ohio State, they had their moments where they proved that they can belong in the top 4. Georgia proved that yesterday against Alabama in the SEC championship game by only losing by 7. Ohio State's proved it by beating Penn State, by beating Michigan, by beating Northwestern. And Georgia's played their tough teams. They've played teams like Auburn and South Carolina when they were ranked. Auburn when they were ranked. They played Kentucky, who was very overachieving this season. They beat Florida convincingly, who beat Kentucky. So you could say that both those teams played competitive football this season. And you can say they were both deserving of having a case of saying that they belong in that top four. But the big flaw of this is that both of these teams have proved that they don't belong in the top four. Georgia proved that they don't belong against LSU by getting blown out by LSU 36-16 on the road in Death Valley. Ohio State proved that they don't belong in the top four by losing by 29 points to a 6-6 Purdue team, a team that barely got bowl eligible. So that's the big flaw of this whole thing, is that you can say that Georgia and Ohio State played competitive football throughout the season. You could say that they proved at a point that they don't belong, that they belong in the top four. All you want. You can say it all you want. But at the end of the day, both these teams, they proved at more times that they didn't belong in the top four than more times than they said that they felt like they should be having a case to belong in that top four. So I'll say that again. Georgia and Ohio State. You can say that they played throughout the season. They played their hearts out this season. I'll give both the teams that. But you can't say that they both deserve a chance to prove themselves they belong in the top four. Yes, they played competitive teams. Yes, they beat competitive teams convincingly. Others maybe not as convincingly as you think. But you can say it all you want. But there was a point where both the teams proved that they don't belong in the top four. If Georgia would have lost to LSU by maybe a field goal or even a touchdown, I could understand the argument of why people feel like Georgia should have been involved in that top four discussion as being one of the four best teams in the country. But they lost by 20. And in my opinion, I feel like if you lose by more than 10 to anyone, I feel like we have no business being in the college football playoff, no business being in the discussion as the four best teams in college football. And both those teams demonstrated that they don't deserve a chance to prove themselves to be in the top four, as they both proved that they don't belong in that top four. They both proved that they don't. Ohio State losing to Purdue by 29 to a 6-6 Purdue team, and Georgia losing by 20 to LSU on the road. And that brings in Oklahoma. And here's the part where it should have been a no-brainer. Oklahoma, they have proved themselves to be part of one of the four best teams in college football. They had one loss to Texas, and it was 45-42 on a last-minute field goal in the winning seconds of it, but they got their vengeance on Texas in the Big 12 championship game. They won pretty convincingly. The defense really stepped up in that game. And they avenged that loss. And that loss, to me, that should automatically null and void it. So technically, Oklahoma has beaten everyone on their schedule. Meanwhile, Georgia and Ohio State hasn't. So in that case, Oklahoma proved that they deserve to be in the discussion for the four best teams in college football, while Georgia and Ohio State, they may have proved that at a point, but they also proved at a point that they don't belong in that top four. So that was the big difference to me. And that's why it should have been a no-brainer to begin with. And I honestly am wondering, after this year, is there a discussion of possibly expanding it to 8 teams? Because if it was 8 teams, you could say that Georgia and Ohio State, they both deserve to be maybe the 8 best teams in college football, but they haven't done enough, or they did too little to be a part of that top 4 of the best teams in college football. Because if you want to look at the pros and cons for all of those teams, Oklahoma's pros, they've beaten everyone on their schedule. They avenged a loss against Texas, so that loss is technically null and void. So beating everybody on their schedule is a pro. Georgia's pro. They played competitive football. They've beaten some ranked opponents. They beat 3 ranked opponents back to back to back in 3 straight weeks. Ohio State's pros. They've beaten teams like Penn State. They've beaten Michigan State on the road. They've beaten Penn State on the road, as well as Michigan State. They've beaten Michigan convincingly. They've beaten Northwestern convincingly. So you could say that those two teams, they have the same resume. They could both be involved in the argument. But the cons for them is that Georgia lost 2 games. Georgia lost to LSU by 20 and to Alabama by 7. Like I said earlier, if Georgia would have lost to LSU by a touchdown or even a field goal in overtime, I can understand the argument for involving Georgia as part of the 4 best teams in college football. But since they lost by 20, I feel like they have no business being in there. And the con for Ohio State is that they lost to Purdue by 29 on the road. They struggled against Nebraska at home. They struggled against Maryland. You could argue and say they could have lost to Nebraska or Maryland pretty easily. They also struggled against Minnesota at some points. They struggled against TCU in week 3 on the neutral site, but they came back in the second half and won. You could say that as well. And that's cons. So you can tell. So the cons for Georgia and Ohio State, they're pretty present. You can see that Georgia and Ohio State, they both have almost the same cons. Losing by more than 20 to a team. And like I said, if you lose by at least 20, you shouldn't have any business being in the discussion for one of the 4 best teams in college football. Especially if you're Ohio State and losing by 29 points to Purdue. Especially if, I know you can make an argument to the SEC was stacked this season. But if you're losing to a team, it doesn't matter if you're losing to Alabama, you're losing to Clemson, or even Notre Dame by 20. If you lose to a team by 20 in general, you don't really have a case to me as being a part of the 4 best teams in college football. And when you looked at the cons for Oklahoma, the only con that you have for Oklahoma is their lack of defense. But their defense stepped it up against Texas in the Big 12 championship game. So that's the only con that you can have for Oklahoma. Because what other con can you put for the Oklahoma Sooners? They've beaten everybody on their schedule. They got their vengeance on Texas. They make that loss null and void. So what other argument could you have to go against Oklahoma other than their defense? Nothing's wrong with the team. You're just saying there's something wrong with the defense. You're just being critical of the Big 12 not playing defense. Well, what if the Big 10 didn't play defense? What if the SEC didn't play defense? What if Alabama was scoring 52 points a game and they lost one game 55-52? Would you not want to include Alabama by not saying they don't play defense? Would you do that? So the problem with that people have that are saying that Ohio State should have gotten in over Oklahoma, Georgia should have gotten in despite losing 2 games. The problem right there is the committee doesn't want to put in a 2-loss team in general. I don't think it matters. Although it does show that maybe they had a little bit of respect for Georgia for playing their hearts against Alabama in the SEC title game and only losing by 7 points. But it's that second game that is penalizing Georgia. A lot of the experts, especially the SEC experts like Jordan Rodgers and Tim Tebow and Paul Feinbaum, saying that Georgia shouldn't be penalized for losing to Alabama. Well, they're not being penalized for losing to Alabama. They're being penalized for losing by 20 points to LSU. And Ohio State, they're being penalized for losing by 29 to Purdue, who barely got bowl eligible, by the way. And Oklahoma, you can't penalize Oklahoma for anything other than the way the team has played. Their defense. Their offense has been playing just fine. It's just the defense that everybody's worried about. And the committee did get it correct once again this season. I will again say that at this time last year, we also had controversy between Alabama and Ohio State for that 4th spot. And this time around, that time around back then last year, Alabama was a 1-loss non-conference champion. Ohio State was a 2-loss conference champion. Notice the difference in this one. Do you notice the difference before anything? Alabama has 1 loss as a non-conference champion. Ohio State may have a conference championship, but they have 2 losses. And there are three things I don't think the committee wants to do. I think the committee is reluctant to do these three things. One is to put in a group of 5 team, which is why UCF isn't moving up in the polls at all. In these rankings, I should say. Number 2, they don't want to put in a non-conference champion. And number 3, they don't want to put in a 2-loss team. So the reason why the committee chose Alabama last year over Ohio State, it's got nothing to do with the pro SEC in the media. It's got nothing to do with they just want Alabama for revenue. They don't want Alabama for marketing. They don't want Alabama for Nick Saban. They wanted Alabama because of their criteria of the 4 best teams in college football. You can say that Alabama did lose a game to Auburn on the road by 13. And I understand if you're going to say it's hypocritical of me, because I had just got done saying not even 5 minutes ago that if you lose a game by more than 10, you should have no business proving yourself to be in the top 4. But this whole thing is a lot different from last year than it was this year. Because last year, Alabama's opponent for that 4th spot was a team that lost 2 games, and both of those games were by more than 10. So that's why Alabama got in, and I can understand and I can respect the fact that if you were going to say in the comment section that I'm being a hypocrite right now. But I'm not being a hypocrite. I'm just explaining why the committee chose what they chose this year and why they chose what they chose this year. So the committee's gotten it right 2 years in a row. And whether or not that this year's discussion is leading to a discussion about another discussion to extend the playoffs to 8 teams, I would be perfectly fine with 8 teams. I feel like I said earlier as well, Georgia and Ohio State, they can make a case for being one of the 8 best teams in college football. I just feel like they can't make their case to be a part of the 4 best teams in college football. Because if you think about it, yes, there was a year where LSU was a 2-loss national champion. LSU won the national championship despite losing 2 games. But that's kind of because towards the end of that year, that was back when we had the BCS. That was back when there was a lot of chaos throughout November. And college football in November is kind of the hardest part in the college football season. It's the boiling point of it. And I've been saying for the last 4 years. But this is why the College Football Playoff Committee, this is why a playoff was created. This is exactly why. Because there are some years that maybe... One of the last years of the BCS was between Alabama and Oklahoma State for that 2nd spot to play LSU. And here's why even the computers got it right back then, like the committee's doing it now. Alabama versus Oklahoma State. If you look at that year, Alabama and Oklahoma State, they both had 1 loss. Alabama's 1 loss was against LSU in a 9-6 grudge match. Oklahoma's 1 loss was to Iowa State, where they blew the game. The kicker missed multiple field goals, multiple turnovers in the game. Oklahoma State was running away with the game, but Iowa State came back and won. Oklahoma State allowed that comeback. And even the computers got it right last year. Alabama deserved their 2nd chance because LSU, and they got it. And they ultimately dominated LSU that year in the national championship. See, this is kind of why. Because I'm comparing this to this year. As we're comparing 1 losses. We're comparing a 1 loss from Oklahoma and a 1 loss from Ohio State. We're comparing both those teams' 1 loss. Oklahoma's 1 loss was to a ranked Texas team. Ohio State's 1 loss was to a 6-6 Purdue team. So the committee got it right this year. Again, you could argue and say they didn't get it right the first year, but Ohio State proved it on the field that they got it right the first time. They got it right the first time. They got it right 2nd and 3rd time. They got it right the 4th time, and they've got it right the 5th time. So all 5 years, they've gotten it right, whether it's proved based off of resumes and based off of losses and based off of wins, or if it's even based off the football field. Alabama won the college football playoff. They won the national championship as the 4th seed last year. Ohio State won the national championship as the 4th seed back in 2014 when this process had its debut and premiere. So the committee's gotten it right every single time, whether it's improved based off of resume, based off of your win-loss record, based off of the cleaner of your loss, whether it's or whether it's on the football field. The committee's gotten it right 5 times. They're 5 for 5. Get over it. And that is all I have to say for this. Comment your thoughts down below. Comment, do you think the committee got it right? Or do you feel like you got it wrong? I can respect if you feel like they got it wrong, but I just feel like they've gotten it right every single time. I think the committee's 5 for 5. So comment your thoughts down below. Also, do you think this could lead into an expansion? Because as soon as I saw that Georgia was number 5, it made me think, are we coming close to what we think to maybe an expansion to 8 teams? Because unfortunately, I think we're still under this process till at least 2023, maybe even longer than that. But I got a feeling that an extension is coming, or a playoff expansion is coming. It may even be sooner rather than later. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thank you for tuning in. Also, like, share, and subscribe.